Well, welcome everyone. Let's start with our conversation today and greetings from sunny Brussels. My name is Bruno. I'm a senior fellow with the German Marshall Fund of the United States. So good afternoon to you, or good morning, depending on what side of the Atlantic you are. I feel very happy today to have this conversation on an issue that I find very interesting, and it's really about talking and understanding the views of young professionals on transatlantic relations. Young professionals today, leaders of tomorrow. So obviously it is important to also have a conversation with the different generations. So very glad indeed to have this event today. Transatlantic relations, I believe, are still on top of the policy agenda. Many different developments occurring, whether it's in the field of security and defense, in the field of trade, in the field of economics. Just think also about tech, climate change. Both sides of the Atlantic share a wide array of interests, but finding a modus vivendi is not always the easiest part of it. However, I think perhaps to end my short intro with a touch of optimism, transatlantic relations, as we see it here at GMF, are still very much alive. And we look forward indeed also at GMF to continue strengthening these transatlantic relations. So I'm very glad indeed that we have this conversation today. We have a wonderful panel that the moderator will introduce to you very shortly. I also want to thank Unfiltered Voices, our partner in the event today, a very wonderful organization under the leadership of Ilyana, our moderator today, and her colleagues, obviously. But really, Unfiltered Voices is giving young professionals a voice in international relations. So Ilyana will tell you a bit more about that, I'm sure. So on my side, this is it. Again, thank you very much for watching, and over to you, Ilyana, to lead the panel.
Great, thank you so much, Bruno. And a big thank you as well to the German Marshall Fund of the United States for giving us the platform today to have this discussion and in working with us to bring this to life. We're very excited and happy to be here today. And also a big welcome to everybody who is tuning in, wherever you are in the world today. It's great to see you here, and we hope you will enjoy this very exciting discussion that we'll have. I'm very happy to be moderating this panel discussion, and we have 4 great speakers lined up. But before I introduce you to our speakers and kick off our discussion, I would like to provide a brief background to what Unfiltered Voices is and what we do for those who are unaware. So I decided to launch Unfiltered Voices last November after a long process of deliberation. And I guess the COVID pandemic provided a good excuse to finally get down to do it. This idea actually came to me a long time ago when it occurred to me that there was a clear absence of young people's and young professionals' views, and that our viewpoints were not being taken into consideration on many key issues. And I began to question why, because I could see, within my professional life, but also my academic, that there were lots of young people who had dedicated a number of years to specialize within their topic area or their region, yet they weren't being granted access to voice their opinion. And I was having conversations with my peers about this, and this was clearly a view shared by a lot of young people. And we also realized that on the rare occasions that they were being given access, it was largely a tick box exercise, in that it was just to fill a quota, to just have a young person at the table. And a lot of the time, our views were having to be adapted or changed just to suit a particular agenda. And what I realized, and many of my peers and friends as well, was that young people and young professionals were beginning to become apathetic towards the issues which essentially impacted and concerned them the most. And so I realized there was a gap to be filled, and as such, Unfiltered Voices was created. And in essence, Unfiltered Voices is a platform run by young people for young people. And I'm extremely proud because since we started back in November last year, I now lead a team of 16 fantastic analysts. And although only 3 our speakers for today's event. All the analysts are experts in their topic area and produce excellent outputs, and they're really helping to develop the platform as well. So a big thank you to them, and I would really urge you all to take a look at our website and read our analysts' opinions and their views, and follow us to keep up to date with everything. We also welcome guest contributors on a regular basis in order to widen the debate as well, because our real aim is to provide fresh perspectives to the issues which we really think matter the most, and to foster a debate. The discussion that we are having today is so important, and it's so good to hear that our voices as young professionals are being heard, and we hope that they will be heard and recognized, so that we can help to contribute to creating a sustainable and strong future for all of us. And it's really great that the GMF has supported us with this today, and we hope that this will be the start of many. The topics chosen for today's discussion on the future of transatlantic relations range from the climate crisis to developments in the cyber and tech world, to international developments, and the increasing threat of Russia and China to the transatlantic alliance, as we believe that these are some of the most pressing issues of today, which will undeniably have an impact on our future. We will hear short presentations from our four great speakers, which will shape the discussion of today's webinar. Please feel free to send through questions during the presenters speaking or after as well. If you do have a particular question aimed at a speaker, please also feel free to put their name down so we know who to direct it to, and we will aim to answer as many questions as possible. I would also really urge those who may not typically like to get involved at events to really take this opportunity to have your voice heard. We don't get this platform often, so if you do, go for it. We'll be happy to answer, and I'm sure the speakers will be more than happy to provide more insights on your questions. So now, without further ado, I am very happy to introduce our first speaker, Nick Gutkin, who is a sustainability analyst at Unfiltered Voices. Nick's research involves remote sensing of forest cover and carbon stocks, as well as investigating global climate change impacts. He is also working at a Dutch startup that rewards farmers for carbon sequestration in agricultural soils. Nick, over to you.
Thank you, Ilyana. So hello to all of you, and a special thank you to both the GMF and Unfiltered Voices for organizing this event. Today, I will be speaking about the ever-growing issue of climate change, how it affects young people, and how the Transatlantic Alliance can take a leadership role by providing real solutions. So I want to focus first on the topic of climate justice, which is the recognition that different groups are impacted differently by climate change, and that this has a lot to do with historical inequalities. So since the Industrial Revolution, fossil fuels have driven development and built wealth in Western countries, while countries in the global South were held back from development, creating inequalities of both wealth and greenhouse gas emissions. And despite their low historical emissions, it's developing countries that are now facing the worst consequences of climate change. And inequality prevents them from being able to properly adapt. So with the rapidly progressing climate crisis, we at Unfiltered Voices believe it's time for high emissions countries to reckon with their historical debts to those least responsible for, yet most impacted by climate change. This is the time for leaders on both sides of the Atlantic to step forward, acknowledge this debt, and secure financing for sustainable climate solutions, specifically focused on reducing inequality. Now, this is a topic of utmost importance for the next generation, which we can see through the growing support for Indigenous movements among young people in the Americas, as well as increasing participation of young people in organizations such as the Climate Justice Alliance. The next generation clearly wants to see a more equitable future, and climate justice is a key part of building such a world. So we as young people are passionate about climate justice, and we would like to see transatlantic cooperation in supporting a just transition to low carbon economies. This includes both an acknowledgement of historical faults and a genuine desire to do better through forward-thinking climate policies by leaders in Europe and the USA. Of course, climate justice would be a largely pointless endeavor without real and effective climate action by governments. And this includes reducing opportunities for polluters to skirt regulations and taxes. At the moment, there are many loopholes in international emissions regulations that allow large multinationals and fossil fuel companies to emit more greenhouse gases, underreport their emissions, and avoid responsibility for the environmental costs of their actions. With regards to transatlantic relations, this presents an opportunity for the US and Europe to utilize their partnership to eliminate such loopholes and prevent companies from getting away with emitting vast amounts of greenhouse gases into the public atmosphere. Ideally, this would be done in coordination with the closing of tax loopholes that allow corporations and rich individuals to avoid paying their fair share of taxes. As we saw, the Pandora Papers that were just published are merely the most recent investigation of the complex ways that the rich use loopholes to hide their money and avoid their responsibility as citizens. Now, the tax and emissions loopholes are directly related, and this is because both are a product of corporate interference in the political sphere and work to absolve companies of their responsibilities to both people and governments. But with two of the world's largest markets, the EU and USA have the leverage to create a more just system of regulations that will reflect the actual impact of fossil fuel emissions. Of course, this is also a very important topic for young people, as we have grown up in an age where wealth inequality is getting worse by the decade, while large companies and rich individuals continue to pollute our environment with seemingly no serious repercussions from governments. And now this brings me to my final point, which highlights a path forward in which national governments and international partnerships support young people in getting involved with climate-related fields. At the moment, there is a distinct and growing disillusionment with governments among young people, because many of the issues we consider most important, such as climate change, are being ignored by politicians despite having monumental and disproportionate effects on our future. If governments, including those in Europe and the USA, want to reduce this trend, they should make serious efforts to increase investment in the training of young people, particularly those from marginalized communities, in fields and trades relevant to climate mitigation and adaptation. At the same time, governments should increase opportunities for young people to take part in the decision-making process, as it is clear from initiatives such as Fridays for Future that we would also like a voice in an issue which so deeply affects us. Finally, the Transatlantic Partnership could increase opportunities for knowledge sharing by creating open access to innovations and technologies that can improve climate outcomes and stimulate young people to get involved with climate change initiatives. From a young person's perspective, and with the COP26 rapidly approaching, there appears to be a lack of political will in actually doing anything about the climate crisis. Of course, this translates into growing discontent and even anger, which is exemplified by movements such as Extinction Rebellion. But this gap between governments and young people does not have to keep growing. Leaders of countries on both sides of the Atlantic are perfectly positioned to institute actual policies that reckon with climate justice, curb fossil fuel emissions, and give young people a voice and a seat at the table. The climate crisis represents a dire situation, but it also represents an opportunity for rethinking so many aspects of how we live our lives today. It represents an opportunity for the current leaders to engage with the next generation to truly build a better world. And most importantly, it represents an opportunity to leave fossil fuels behind and start to heal both our environment and our communities. So thank you for listening, and I would be happy to answer any questions on this topic.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick. I think there's so much there, so much food for thought, and it's really good ideas as well for us to be able to take on board and to think about moving forward. Nick also wrote a great article for Unfiltered Voices quite recently on 3 things that we could do to make an impact and make a change for the climate crisis. So thank you. That leads us on quite well to our second speaker of this webinar, Natalie Domas, who is a sub-Saharan Africa analyst at Unfiltered Voices. Her research focuses on the impacts of conflict and development in the region, including perspectives on gender equality. Natalie recently published a paper in the Journal of Immigrant and Refugee Studies and also works as a program officer for a peace-building charity. Natalie, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ilyana. And I want to say hello to everyone and thank you very much to the German Marshall Fund and to Unfiltered Voices for organizing this event. So today I will be speaking about how the transatlantic relationship between the US and the EU can impact international development and the future of how development aid can be used to either hinder or help sustainable and inclusive peace. So I want to start by echoing some of the things that Nick mentioned, because the transatlantic partnership has a lot of potential to pave the way to sustainably respond to some of the most pressing matters that we as a global community are facing. So as globalization continues to move forward, our societies and communities are only going to become more intertwined, which means that if we actually want the ability to sustainably respond to the impacts of climate change, mass migration, cybersecurity, and conflict, the big international players like the US and the EU should reimagine a joint partnership for development where they utilize their positions of power, both in terms of influence and finances, to prioritize inclusive, local, and human-centered approaches to development, because this will in turn lead to an increase in security and stability in key regions for the US and the EU. So it goes without saying that the US and the EU are some of the biggest donors for international development. However, what has been happening on both sides of the Atlantic is that the US and EU governments are taking an increasingly securitized approach to international development and its funding. This means that countries who are experiencing fragile or volatile situations in terms of their stability are being perceived as security threats, which alters the approach that the US and EU take in these interventions. So this is concerning for 3 reasons. Firstly, it restricts what organizations who receive this development funding can do in terms of on-the-ground projects, especially when it comes to community engagement and inclusive mediation processes. For instance, many armed groups who are involved in civil conflicts have been labeled as terrorist groups, which restricts the ability of nonprofit organizations who receive funding from the US or the EU to be able to engage these groups in mediation projects, which can either delay or spoil possible peace talks. Second, an increasingly securitized approach to development and development funding risks alienating marginalized groups, such as youth and women, from participating in the mediation process. This can impact the sustainability of peace that is created because it would not allow for the grievances of other demographics to be heard, addressed, and integrated into the post-conflict society. And it would also not allow these groups to have a say in how their community develops, even though they will be directly affected by the decisions made during mediation talks. Thirdly, this runs the risk of dehumanizing international development projects because it takes on a more traditional zero-sum game approach that isn't as compatible with modern conflicts and how these conflicts reshape societies in the long term. There's a reason that civil society organizations and academics have been pushing for development aid to become more grassroots and community oriented. And it's because those types of interventions and projects have shown that inclusive human-centered projects yield a more successful outcome for conflict mitigation. And this is where I think the Transatlantic Partnership has immense power to put international development back on this track. This securitized approach takes on a more individualistic nature, but that's not the way the world is heading today, and it's not likely to change course in the future. So with this new transatlantic partnership, I think that not only should a less securitized approach be prioritized, but from a conceptual and financial perspective, it should be less focused on completing projects in a handful of countries that use traditional funding mechanisms, and instead explore working with organizations that work directly with local partners on things like capacity building and the use of direct cash transfers. So the reason I say this is related to the whole purpose of this event and the purpose of Unfiltered Voices, which is to hear the perspectives of young people. So my generation and the generation after have grown up at a time where we're easily able to connect with people from all around the world and share experiences without ever needing to meet in person, which has caused young people to see global inequality and its causes and consequences more easily than before. And I think that this has caused young people to really care about the relationship that Western countries have with the rest of the world and the interventions that Western countries conduct, because we see the results of those interventions almost instantaneously. Most recently, I'm thinking about what happened in Afghanistan and how within a matter of hours, videos and live updates of what was happening in Kabul were going viral across all social media platforms. And young people who may not have been following the intricate ins and outs of the conflict over the last 20 years could still all of a sudden see the impact of how the decisions of Western governments can affect people halfway across the globe. And I think that when this ability of being able to witness other realities is combined with some of the collective thoughts of young people towards things like institutionalized racism and decolonization, you can begin to understand what we as young people really want to see from Western governments, which is using their resources as a force for good and embracing the diversity and intercultural nature of the world that we live in, instead of seeing that as a possible security risk. And I think what this really creates is an opportunity for this revamped transatlantic partnership to integrate and consider the voices of young people. I think that this type of partnership for international development would create an opportunity to uplift the voices of not only local peace builders, but specifically young peace builders and community leaders who could have a real impact on the development of their countries if they were given a consistent seat at the table. So if the US and EU can reshape their partnership and create a collective approach to development that focuses less on retreating inward and instead prioritizes the inclusive involvement of local actors in peace, mediation, and development processes, this could help begin a positive trend towards a new era of international development that better includes all voices. Thank you very much. I will leave it there and happy to discuss this further during the question and answer.
Great, thank you so much, Natalie. That was very insightful. And yes, resources as a force for good is definitely something that we should take as a slogan or a title. But lots of interesting information there. And I'm sure we'll have some more questions at a later point today in our discussion. But I think at this point, it would be really good to hear that now that we've had two speakers from Unfiltered Voices, the view and perspective from the German Marshall Fund. And I'm very happy to introduce our third speaker, Ilyana Kubenko, who currently works in the Security and Defense Program at the GMF. Prior to this, she helped promote the work of Ukrainian think tanks in the EU by engaging with the Ukrainian think tank liaison office in Brussels. Ilyana has a background in international security and development, and I'm sure she has a lot to say on security and defense this afternoon.
Thank you so much, Ilyana, and good afternoon, everyone. I am very excited to be here, and partly because supporting transatlantic relations is one of the main priorities of the German Marshall Fund where I work. And since it's a very broad topic, actually, it covers so many aspects, and I work in the security and defense. This is the area that I want to focus my presentation on. And more specifically today, I will look at the rise of China and threat of Russia, and also I will finish off with the role of NATO and my opinion about it in this dimension. But let me first start with a little bit of introduction about where we are right now with transatlantic relations. I think that when the current US administration took office, there were very high expectations about the future of transatlantic relations. And yes, indeed, in some way, the cooperation has revitalized, as we've seen. However, I think that there are obvious challenges that remain. And the recent decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, or the security pact AUKUS that was between the US, UK, and Australia, it really demonstrates the nature of this challenge. So let me start with China. And what I would like to say here is that the US really takes Europe as a strategic partner, and it considers Europe as a strategic partner. However, we can see that it's really shifting its focus from Europe towards China and balancing China. And over a few years, I think both Europe and the US, they've taken a very different approach towards the rise of China. And Washington quite recently underwent the reassessment of its national priorities and strategies, and it's really given primacy towards maybe competition, but some might say confrontation with China. And Europe, on the other hand, it sees China more as a strategic rival. And while the EU is starting, of course, to realize the challenges that come from all the infrastructure investments and just other threats in general, I think it's much more reluctant to act because of its much larger economic exposure to China. And for these reasons, the US is taking a much more radical position than the EU is. And the security pact that I just mentioned, it actually demonstrates how the US is ready to take opportunities in order to try and sustain or combat the rise of China militarily. And even if it means ignoring interests of Europe. And as the reason of this reluctance to act, the EU is actually finding itself on the sidelines and needs to reevaluate its strategy going forward. And let me finish with this point of China by saying that, in my view, to successfully deal with this challenge, I think the US and Europe should really find a common position and also work closely together in a concerted approach. And so I'll be moving to Russia, of course, because what else, right? I'll start by saying that concerns over the security threat posed by Russia, they have been actually this glue that held together the post-Second World War Transatlantic alliance. And as a result, however, recently, I think, or not that quite recently, that both Europe and the US, they're starting to view this challenge very differently. And as a result of shifting US priority towards China, I think some in Europe actually feel that the focus would also shift from Russia. And I think it's very important to say that, of course, there is no unified front in Europe. Europe is very different. And on the one hand, we have the Baltic states, we have Poland that are understandably much more vocal about the Russia-related questions. However, we also have, on the other hand, Germany and France that are acting very differently and from a more pragmatic perspective from their view. In case in point, it was very important for Germany to finish the Nord Stream 2 because of economic benefits. And as I mentioned before, the US really is trying to put the resources towards dealing with China. And as well as the example of the pulling out from Afghanistan and trying to also move to the Indo-Pacific. And I think that despite of initially very strong stance of the Biden administration about Russia, we don't really see concrete action with containing Russian influence in Eastern Europe. And there are actually quite a few security threats coming from there, be it the armed conflict in Ukraine, political unrest in Belarus and other tensions, as well as the massive disinformation campaign and the spread of anti-EU rhetoric in a way. And what I'm afraid of, speaking in my view, is that if there is too much attention going away from China, it might be dangerous or make transatlantic relations a bit more fragile, considering that the US and Europe do see Russia as a destabilizing factor. And by completely understanding the rationale behind focusing on China, I still see Russia as one of the main priorities going forward for the US and Europe. And ideally, they should find a unified stance, which is actually lacking right now. And let me finish with my last point. I really believe that any conversation about transatlantic relations, it cannot really go without at least briefly mentioning the role of NATO. And here I would like to say that I know that NATO has gone under scrutiny recently, and really many questioned its relevance to appropriately respond to challenges of today, be it the rise of China, threats of Russia that I mentioned, or as well as the new challenges stemming from emerging technologies and climate change, as Nick was talking about. And in my opinion, however, I think the EU and US, they should really look into these challenges via the framework of NATO, rather than trying to look for other alliances or individual responses. And yeah, the concept of security has really changed in the recent years. And I do think that to address these challenges of nowadays, and it's really important to have a strong transatlantic unity. And NATO, with all of its vulnerabilities and the internal challenges as well as external challenges, I think it is a good example of how Europe and the US can work together and have a successful transatlantic partnership going forward. And I will finish here. I hope I didn't take too much time. And thank you. Looking forward for the questions and further discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Ilyana. It's really great to hear the GMF's perspective, but also your own perspective as well on what you think about the Transatlantic Alliance. And that, yes, I mean, definitely China is the hot topic, and Russia perhaps not so much anymore, but it's definitely still there. And I think this brings us very nicely to our final speaker, Arda, who will, I'm sure, have a lot to say about Russia and China in the cyber and tech world. But just before he begins, I'd like to provide a short introduction. So Arda is a anti-money laundering, blockchain, and cyber analyst at Unfiltered Voices. His research involves identifying new money laundering and terrorist financing methods enabled by emerging payment technologies, so very sophisticated. He's also currently pursuing a PhD at University College London and also works as a cryptocurrency threat analyst. So Arda, we're looking forward to hear a lot of interesting details about China and Russia.
Thank you very much, Ilyana, and it's amazing to be invited here to such an amazing event and to follow on also from such amazing speakers as well. And it's a great pleasure, of course, to give you a bit more of a sort of cyber, sort of techie and cyber crime perspective of where I think transatlantic relations and the next generation leadership will have to focus on going forward. And I think there are three very clear statistics, right, which really put this problem into perspective and just emphasize how important it is. And those are that, number one, we are now seeing a ransomware attack once every 11 seconds. And that is huge, and it's only getting worse by the year. Secondly, we are seeing that the vast majority of these ransomware attacks are being pursued and facilitated by common adversaries of the Transatlantic Alliance, namely Russia and China, as you've suggested, against the Transatlantic Alliance. And thirdly, I think we are seeing a substantial sort of convergence, if you like, from attacks against private companies, which from a national security perspective, we might say is not a huge priority comparatively, to critical infrastructure, such as hospitals. And earlier this year, we saw one against the Colonial Pipeline in the United States, for example. And I think it's important for the next generation to really look at these attacks and identify different vectors, if you like, whereby we can stop them from taking place. And I think, well, one area, one key vector, like that we've been looking into as part of our research is how ransomware criminals cash out, right? If we can prevent ransomware criminals from laundering the illicit proceeds, i.e. the ransoms that they gain, you will reduce the incentive for them to continue committing those attacks in the future. And we can't really have that conversation any further if we don't, first of all, talk about blockchain technologies and cryptocurrencies. Right now, 98% of all ransomware attacks demands ransom in cryptocurrency. And there's a very specific, well, there are three very specific reasons for that. And the first is that, of course, blockchain technologies are anonymous, not entirely anonymous, but comparatively more anonymous than modern normal standard payment technologies. They are decentralized. We don't have a central bank or a certain government or a specific financial institution that are overseeing payments and facilitating transactions on the blockchain network. And also they are borderless, right? And I really think that is where the Transatlantic Alliance comes in. If we see, for example, one country taking action against cryptocurrencies, banning them or implementing regulations just to prevent it from being used for criminal purposes, it's not really going to have much of an impact. It will only have a marginal impact at most because it's a borderless technology. But if the Transatlantic Alliance is involved in developing a unified response to these technologies at an allied level, bearing in mind, of course, that the Transatlantic Alliance involves some of the largest and most advanced economies in the world, it will have a far greater impact. And I think that's really also where the next generation comes in as well, because if you look at cryptocurrencies and new emergent payment technologies, you will see that the vast majority of its users are the younger generation. And they'll be very much, therefore, involved, of course, in sort of providing input, if you like, on how new regulations, new anti-money laundering regulations will look at when the Transatlantic Alliance gets into regulating this space going forward. And that's, of course, very, very important for another reason, and that is that this technology space, blockchain technologies, etc., have a massive, massive benefit to society as well, right? From making supply chains more efficient, we've seen the importance of that with the recent fuel crises in America and Europe, right, to increasing access to finance. And I think if we truly harness these technologies and really sort of aim to allow innovation to take place, while of course effectively and efficiently limiting and minimizing its exposure to criminal activity, the Transatlantic Alliance can gain a strategic advantage, not only in the cyber defense space, but also in the financial space and technological space and all other aspects as well, over its common adversaries. And I think the next generation, of course, will have, like I said, a significant impact in deriving those regulations, and it'll be very interesting, of course, to see how successful they will be. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Ada. Super interesting and a lot of food for thought as well there. So a big thank you to the speakers for their great presentations, which have obviously shaped the next parts of our event. I can see some questions coming through now in the Q&A box. So great, please feel free to send more. I think I'd like to kick off the Q&A session with two questions. One for Nick and one for Ilyana. I think we'll take them in batches of two so that we have time for more and we can answer as many as possible. So may I please ask the speakers to provide brief and succinct answers to the questions. So for Nick, I was thinking sort of coming off from what you said, what do you think, so what types of policy decisions by leaders of the Transatlantic Partnership would create actual and impactful climate change mitigation, in your opinion? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that. And Ilyana, you mentioned a lot about the sort of US-China relationship, the fact that, you know, the US and the Transatlantic Alliance is placing a heavy emphasis on that, more so than before. Biden and Xi just agreed to hold a virtual summit this year, and this decision marks the first sign of improving US-China relations since the new Biden administration in Washington. What do you think this means for the relationship moving forward? Do you think this is a step in the right direction, and what we might expect from this summit? So please feel free to answer those questions. And perhaps we can start with you, Nick, and then move on to Ilyana.
Am I starting, Ilyana?
Yeah.
Sorry, I paused out there. Yeah, so in terms of policy decisions, I'm just going to quickly highlight three major decisions. So like I mentioned, reducing loopholes for emitters, but also bringing in real consequences for emissions. So essentially giving teeth to regulations that currently exist, something like the Paris Agreement, if it actually had teeth. Next, a global carbon tax with the proceeds going directly to fund green development, and especially to fund green development in developing countries. And finally, global efforts to move economic models away from consumption-based models to something that is more holistic and something that is more based on the actual well-being of people.
Great, thanks. Ilyana, do you want to answer your question and then we can move on to the other question?
Yeah, sure. I want to start by saying that I think that cooperation is so much more important than the competition or the confrontation that you have been trying to do in the past few decades with China. And I think the fact that Biden agreed to have a summit, I think this is a good thing. I think both sides need to agree on the things going forward, agree to actually discuss how both of them being very strong powers, both economically and militarily and technologically, I think what they really need to discuss is how to cooperate with each other moving forward, how to have a better, stronger alliance rather than trying to constantly compete with each other, trying to agree how to cooperate with all other countries in what is some of the most important issues right now is in climate and of course the technologies. And that's what I hope and I want to see coming from there. And yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. So it looks like we're getting quite a lot of questions coming through. Let's go with the first question is directed to Natalie. So how can young people become more aware or take more action to advocate for changes in how development is done when a lot of the decisions are being made by older people in top positions, which I think is a great question for you to answer. And well, there's a lot I'm just going through now. Arda, perhaps we can take for you 2 questions. The first being, many criminals are using cryptocurrencies that are less traceable than the mainstream ones. How do you see policy formation of privacy enhanced coins such as Monero going forward? And how can the Transatlantic Alliance help this? And just sort of an add-on to that, should cyber cryptocurrency related topics be taught as part of the curriculums at schools, in your opinion? So Natalie, let's start with you and then we can move to Arda.
Yeah, happy to. It's a great question. And I think one that can definitely be applied to many different topics. But, you know, for development specifically, I think it just comes down to if it is something that you're interested in, it starts with research. It starts with reading different things, like using Unfiltered Voices as a platform to read about these topics that you're interested in and start to educate yourself a little bit on the ins and outs of this sector to get a little bit more understanding. But then not only that, it's supporting organizations who are directly involved in this type of work, you know, even if it is following them on social media or looking at their websites and checking out their publications. These types of nonprofits are publishing, you know, publications and fact sheets all the time on all the things that they do. And if you have a regional focus or regional interest, look at organizations that are operating out of those countries and regions, and go down to really the local level. You know, look at the international level, like, you know, INGOs, but then also go down further to that more grassroots level that I mentioned, because that's where you'll see the work that's being done by local leaders. And that's where you'll also get the involvement of, you know, young people and women. And I think that another way to get involved, if you live in a country where you can freely participate in the democratic process, it's to vote. And it's to make your voice heard to your elected representatives on things like defense bill spending. You know, for instance, I think last year globally, about $3 billion was spent on peace building initiatives. But compare this to the about $1,981 billion that was spent on military expenditures. So that's something that if you are aware of your country's spending habits, you can advocate to your elected representatives to try and influence that change if that is something that, you know, you care about. So yeah, it's definitely, you know, bringing that power to the polls. And then also educating yourself and just reading as much as you can, and then following organizations on social media. It's one of the amazing things about the very digital world that we live in, that even very local organizations that are based out of remote regions, they have websites that you can go and look at their projects and get involved in. So yeah, there's a few things you can do for sure.
In terms of the 2 questions addressed to me, thank you very much for them. Just for context, for those of you who might be unaware, normal cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, you can actually see the transaction amounts going from different cryptocurrency addresses to other addresses, etc. So you can actually see those transaction details on what we call the public blockchain. And there are some coins, cryptocurrencies like Monero, as a question described, that are privacy enhanced, where you can't actually see that kind of data. And of course, that makes them incredibly private, incredibly difficult to track, and therefore quite useful for cyber criminals who are dealing narcotics, illicit narcotics, for example, on the dark web. And I think in terms of policy, we need to do two things, right? So you can't buy privacy enhanced coins such as Monero on established cryptocurrency exchanges. You have to go to very obscure exchanges on the dark web, for example, to buy these kinds of privacy enhanced coins. That's already shows a sort of reasonable success in international pressure. But first of all, what we have to do is clarify what owning privacy enhanced coins means legally, right? So how does it look in court? If someone's been caught and they've been found to hold some Monero, what does that mean legally in the court of law? Is that something that you can use as evidence against them, for example, in a cybercrime case, etc.? We have to clarify that, number one. And number two, we really need to start looking into, for example, shutting down exchanges on the dark web that do deal in Monero, etc. The Netherlands, the United States has been instrumental in shutting down darknet markets, for example, on the dark web. And I think similar efforts should be directed to exchanges that are allowing criminals to exchange Bitcoin and other such normal cryptocurrencies into Monero as well. In terms of the second question, in terms of whether cryptocurrency should be taught as curriculum in schools and cyber programming, etc., I would say absolutely. I believe many countries are now teaching programming at a young age to children. I think that's a very good development. In terms of cryptocurrency, I think there definitely needs to be more public awareness of what it is and what it involves, because there's an awful lot of scams and Ponzi schemes going around involving cryptocurrency. The amount of friends I have had come to me and show me their sort of phone saying, look, I bought this obscure coin, is this a scam? And the answer is almost always, regrettably, yes, very obviously. So I think in terms of a public service announcement, I just say, don't believe everything you see on Twitter, all right? When you see an announcement for a new cryptocurrency that's going to make you rich in 2 days, it's not going to, that's a scam. So I definitely do think that, yes, there should be more public awareness around these topics to prevent those kinds of cyber crimes going on as well.
Great. I mean, yes, that's definitely, if we take one thing away from this webinar, is not to be easily fooled when it comes to crypto and coins. And I'm sure Arda would be more than happy to answer some more questions about this offline, should there be a need, as he has really specialized in this topic area. So thank you. We're getting quite a few questions, so that's great. Please feel free to send more questions in. It looks like we have quite a few questions directed to Nick, which is hardly surprising given the climate crisis is here and happening now. But before that, I think there's a question here for Ilyana, which is, what is your view on the UN membership of China and Russia? How could they better help, or I guess enhance, the UN's work? And for Nick, there are a few questions, perhaps we can group them again. I think there's quite a lot of overlap. Someone asks, is there not a great focus of the young people on climate issues mean that other matters important for transatlantic relations, such as cooperation on new technologies, energy security, and classic cooperation, security and defense, become too elusive for the next generation? Are we, the young leaders, not over-focusing on more recent problems, neglecting the well-known but not resolved ones? And just to add on to that one, someone asks, the lack that, Nick, you mentioned, the lack of willingness of Western governments to fight climate change and injustice. This person thinks that it is reflected in the general population, particularly because this person comes from Germany, and he thinks, or he or she thinks, there is a great disparity between young people fighting for a sustainable world, both in ecological and socio-economical regards, and older generations who do not prioritize sustainability. associating it more with decreased wealth and comfort. How can we combat this discrepancy? So some interesting questions for you there. So perhaps Ilyana, you can answer the first question and then we can move on to next.
Sure. Thank you very much for the question about the UN. And I just want to say that, you know, the UN was founded basically in order to have this prosperity and peace all over the world, especially after all the atrocities after the Second World War. And it's great to actually have Russia and China there, right? I mean, these are one of the big powers nowadays, and obviously it just wouldn't be possible to not have them as part of the UN. And if I may focus a bit more on Russia in this question, is I really wish that it was more difficult for Putin to use his idea of how Russia should move in the legal framework and use the veto power in the Security Council and made a decision based on that. And I understand that UN is full of basically governments, right? I mean, while it is a multilateral institution, it's mostly everything is done with the decision of the representatives of governments. And it really is tricky sometimes because not whole, I believe, not whole of Russia agrees, right, with everything that the government does. And I just want to see somehow some changes in the end, possibly trying to make it more difficult for countries like China or countries like Russia to actually put their like government pressure on everything that is made and decided in the UN level. Yeah, thank you. Hope it answers.
Great, thanks. I just want to add on to that as well. I mean, I think the Russia-China topics are always very hot and of interest. So perhaps this could be a stepping point for our next discussion where we can get some other young professionals' views on that, including yourselves, Ilyana, as it seems, you know, it's something that is here and it's present. So thanks for that. Nick?
Yep, so actually, I think I'm going to address both questions together. So the first question was regarding essentially, if we focus too much on climate change, we're leaving behind a lot of classical issues such as security, such as technologies, and such as energy security, for example. So I think that there's a bit of a difference in generations. Oh, sorry, and the second question was about the generations with regards to climate change. So I think that there's a difference in the approach that different generations have had traditionally to issues such as this. I think that the more traditional approach is to look at each of these issues as separate and as its own issue. You know, you have your conflict, you have your energy security, you have your technological development. But something that I think is growing rapidly in the sustainability field, and something that I find really amazing, is the interaction between all of these things. And especially the fact that many young people, due to social media, due to being able to learn more about what's happening around the world, are seeing a lot of connections and a lot of the hidden webs behind all these issues. So for example, something like conflict might seem completely unrelated to climate change until you consider that the fact that climate change will drive increased droughts, increased loss of resources, water issues, and will drive conflict, such as the first conflict that was connected to climate change was the Syrian civil war. Energy security is the same thing. When we talk about energy security versus climate change, we're talking about a decentralization of energy systems for favoring renewable energy. So all of these issues are really interconnected, and I think that younger generations are seeing a lot of this interconnectivity in a way that older generations have not. So how do we really bridge this discrepancy? I think that's a very difficult issue. And I think that that's something where older generations do come in as the ones with more political power, because I think that really it's the time for a lot of older generations to bring young people into the conversation, into leadership positions, to have a voice and a seat at the table, and actually be able to give their input on these things. Because of our different approach and because our different lived experiences are able to contribute something different, which is a more well-rounded and a more interconnected, I would say, approach to all of these issues. So thank you for the questions.
Great, thanks. And yeah, there are many questions for you, Nick. So again, this is definitely something to take into consideration for next time. So we have around 5 minutes left, and we still have quite a few questions to address. So perhaps I can start grouping them together. Natalie, I think there's one here that would be good for you to answer. This person asks, what have you found are the most productive ways to get next generation voices to be heard within our own organizations, and more broadly, to link up with other experts in the transatlantic field at the peer level? So perhaps a bit more of your personal insight into your journey and what has helped you. Also, Arda, El Salvador has adopted Bitcoin as their legal tender, first in the world. China has banned its mining of trade of crypto. What does this mean for the developed economies, and in particular for the Transatlantic Alliance economies? And it's just also great to say thank you, everybody, for all the great messages that you're sending through about Unfiltered Voices and your support as well. It's great to hear that you have enjoyed our discussion today. So perhaps, Natalie, you can kick off with that question, and then we can move to Arda.
Yeah, happy to. Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it's one that a lot of organizations now should start to reflect on. You know, a lot of organizations have been thinking about the inclusion of gender, so making sure that, you know, there's more women involved, also racial equality within their organizations. But I think also this can be expanded to include young people, you know, kind of look at the overall age, you know, the median age of what you have in your organization. If all of a sudden you look at, you know, obviously your senior level people will be a little bit older, but then also looking at retention. Are you able to retain young people who you hire in entry level positions? And then are you able to create an environment where you can foster their professional development in a way that they become more valuable to your organization in the long term? So I think it's not only about obviously hiring young people, because I think every single young person can agree that the job market is incredibly difficult right now. And it's not only in Western countries, this is all over the world. You know, thinking specifically of the African continent, it has one of the youngest populations in the world, yet so many countries are reeling with like massive levels of youth unemployment. So I think that is something that governments have to address to try and, you know, aid youth unemployment, but that organizations themselves have to take clear decisions on to bring young people more to play a more active role in their organizations, and to possibly try and reduce turnover of young people, since I know that's also a trend for our generation, is kind of having one job for 1 year or being in a post for 6 months and then moving on. Because that can help with professional development. And I think, you know, that's fostering our abilities, which will only lead to better things in the long term. And then when it comes to, you know, broadly linking up with other experts in the transatlantic field at the peer level, I'm going to say it's the digital sphere. There's so many great, obviously I know in some like publication things, there's paywalls behind them, which obviously don't service young people very well who are a little strapped for cash. But this is where things like Twitter even can, you know, come in handy. There's, you know, I have a Twitter account as well. So yeah, just those types of exchanges online that can really help with a free exchange of ideas at the peer level all across the world.
Great, thank you. And
I'll be very quick if you like.
Yeah, that'll be great.
That'll be very, very quick. I think that the short answer is it's too early to tell. I think El Salvador, we'll have to watch how it goes, the integration, how it continues. I think remittances are a huge aspect of the global economy that crypto is very well suited for. So I'll be very interested to see El Salvador's case and how they proceed. In terms of China, I would say simply they've banned it before and then they've backtracked, etc. And the last time they banned it, crypto usage went up in China by 200%, which emphasizes what I said during my speech, that one country banning it is not exactly going to do much good. It's a borderless technology. And the most recent time they've banned it, of course, we did notice that crypto barely took a hit in terms of how much one Bitcoin was worth. So it'll be interesting to see, but it's too early to tell, would be my very quick response to that question.
Great, thank you. Well, unfortunately, we have some more questions, but perhaps our analysts can reply to them in their own time. Unfortunately, this is all we have time for today. Just wanted to add to what Natalie was saying in terms of sort of how to get next generation voices heard. One thing that I found a lot of the time is just reaching out and actually actively approaching people and talking to them and speaking to them in a way that, you know, doesn't sort of put you in a lower position. You know, you have to sort of come across as you're on the same, you have just the same amount of rights as somebody who has been working or doing something for X amount of years. Your views, our views are just as important. So this should definitely not deter you. And there are many organizations, and I'm seeing this a lot now, which are creating leadership programs, fellowship programs, which are very inclusive and are really trying to foster younger people to get up to that level and to get their voices heard. So I would really encourage anybody out there who is a bit confused on, you know, how to get their voices heard to do that. But of course, Unfiltered Voices is, you know, that is the reason why we exist, is to provide a platform. So if you are interested as well, please feel free to contact us. As I said, we always look out for new voices and new opinions, and we'd be happy to speak to new people as well. Well, unfortunately, I wish we didn't have to end here, but we do. I think it's been a great discussion. I've learned a lot. I'm sure you all have too. It's been great to have so many people attend for our first event. A big thank you again to the German Marshall Fund for working with us to bring this together. I really hope this will be the first of many, and I hope you will join me in thanking our wonderful speakers and all the people involved in making this happen today. So goodbye for now, and we hope to see you again very, very soon. Thank you.
Thank you.